It's recording. Sunny, would you like to
Yeah.
introduce our guest speaker today?
Yeah. Um, Let me see. I think um, the there is Earth Day not that far away from here. It's I think it's this week, right? Thursday is the Earth Day, and one of the things that one of the progressive Christians theology or tenets of our belief is of caring for the earth and caring for the creation, to creation care. And in this pandemic, one of the things that we have come to really realize is that if we don't take care of nature and build a good, harmonious relationship with nature, nature will come and bite us, literally. And we've seen the impact of that. And so, and if we do not develop our understanding, a better understanding on how to live with nature, whether it is pandemics or whether it is some kind of floods or tornadoes or the blizzards or whatever drought that we're experiencing in Southern California, then all these other things will come about that really affects our lives and who we are, and affects our ability or our message of what it means to be people of faith. And so it really is really important to really understand about the importance of caring for nature and creation and the climate change. In this, we've gone through a president who did not believe in the climate change, and we have seen the impact of all these fossil fuel and other things, and yet the refuse to believe in the science. And now we're trying to get back into dealing with the climate accord. And I don't know if you guys been reading or not. Do you remember about reading about this huge ice sheet about a third of the size of whales that broke off from Antarctica? Now they can't even track it because it basically all melted already. That entire glacier basically has disappeared. And so now so all these things are happening even in the midst of the pandemic. And as we come out of, so that I wanted us to really even to recognize the importance of climate issues. But not only that, but I think Rebecca also can talk about the impact of the climate change to human suffering, especially to the global hunger issues. Not necessarily here as much, even though that's significantly impacted, but especially in Africa and other places where there is just incredible human suffering and starvation that is going on. And so Rebecca is the Presbyterian Church USA, Presbyterian Church's coordinator for Presbyterian Hunger Program. And I'm on the advisory committee, and so she's the boss, and or I guess I'm her boss. No, whichever way, right? But Rebecca has come and has spoken at the climate crisis conference that I was part of running, and and doing other things, and she has spoken nationally on these issues. And I really thought it was important to hear from her about what is going on and importance, and what really are the issues in the climate change situation, or any other questions you might have on the areas that you might want to talk about, because anything with the hunger and the global climate issues and importance of creation care and all of those things, she can cover a broad spectrum of issues. But I just thought, really about climate change. Where are we now, that since we haven't talked about that nationally for a whole year, or at least 5 years anyway, and now then where are we, where is the world at, and also how is the global hunger issue that's dealing with that. The exciting part about what Rebecca does is, and there's that her committee gives out about $1 million a year in grant, in the United States and overseas, to various programs that deals with the root causes of hunger. And right now, she can, if she wants to go there, she can talk about some of those kind of things and where we are, how we are making difference. And maybe even you can talk about how some of our, efforts have been changed because of what's going on in the climate. So is there any specific questions any of you would want Rebecca to address? Anything particular that you are interested in? Because she's so versed in all these areas that she can talk about a number of things. So
Well, I can start. I think in this past year with the pandemic, just from how I've seen things, there hasn't been as much discussions mentioned about climate change because we're not like we're supposed. I mean, we're all sheltering in place. And so, Rebecca, from your point of view, how has the pandemic affected, number one, the dialogue around climate change, and then the second, the actual impact that climate change has had in the world during the pandemic? Because, like, as an aside, like in LA, like there was a photo when the pandemic started, because we usually have like smog outside, but once the cars were out on the road, it was like clear skies all over again. And so I just want to hear from you, like in your work, I guess those two aspects. What have you seen from your perspective during this pandemic?
great, thank you. Marika or Christina, did you want to say anything?
Also, at some point, something that I've been thinking a lot about is how, like, I don't know, you think a lot of the world's producers of like greenhouse gases and emissions and stuff are like these developing countries, or even within the United States, it's like big businesses and stuff. And so how we as just consumers and people can sort of regain control and actually make an impact, even though we're just like one person. Something I've been wondering if you want to touch on that at some point.
I actually had a really similar question about what the role of individual action should be in the climate crisis, because the main contributors are obviously large fossil fuel companies or multinational corporations, or really entities that it seems like a single person can't make a difference against. But I was just curious about what impact one person can truly have on this issue.
Yeah, so we'll start with those questions, and if others come up, then put them in the chat or interrupt me. This can be as informal or however it emerges, I'm comfortable with. I think these are great questions, and they really remind me of the questions that are being asked right now in a 1,000-person online gathering in Washington, D.C. There's a workshop actually just ending right now called Ecumenical Advocacy Days. And depending where you all go after graduations and so forth, you might keep an eye in the future. It's an annual event where people of all different Christian backgrounds come together. I assume it'll be hybrid next time around because the online format is going so well, but it's usually in person. It includes a lobby day to your members of Congress, your elected officials. So what's interesting is the same questions about individual action. What do we do? How do we wrestle with climate change is actually the theme this year for Ecumenical Advocacy Days. Sometimes it's homelessness, sometimes it's, other social issues, but this year it's environmental justice. So I'll start just by saying, I think, we have a little bit of an uphill battle as progressive Christians or progressive people of faith to talk about climate in settings of faith, because a lot of the news media has co-opted a Christian voice as being very, very conservative on climate change and other environmental issues. But the truth is, if you really look at the Bible, it's a pretty clear message from Genesis, when there's the story of God creating Adam and putting Adam in the garden. The language is actually translated to serve and preserve the garden. So that's actually kind of our primary human motivation. So one thing that I'll often say in conversations about how much does individual action matter? That's a really important question, and we'll get to it. But also, part of why we act is because it's for our own good. It's what we believe God calls us to, and it shapes who we become in the world. So there's a theory, there are different kind of ethical frameworks. One is called values ethic, and it's basically, I don't know what the ultimate good is. I don't know if the outcome outweighs the impact, etc. But I'm going to do this action because it creates who I become tomorrow, and it creates who I become 10 years from now, and it creates who I become 30 years from now. And so my individual actions are for me as well as for the world. So I've always thought that was just kind of interesting, is partly we just should do it because it's the right thing to do and because God calls us to do it, but also because it's a really personal decision of who we want to become. But also we do know that while corporations are hugely responsible for a lot of emissions, corporations are made up of people. They're made up of board members, they're made up of corporate executives, and those people have families and friends. And what shapes all of their decisions, financial bottom line is big, but otherwise what really shapes is what their peers think, what their families think, and what culture is. And what families and peers and culture are all made up of individuals. So I do actually really believe that our individual actions can have a cumulative effect, a ripple effect. So it can be hard to see, but the more we can build a culture of not consuming wastefully, not just being totally mindless and thoughtless in our actions, the better we're going to create a scenario to hold people accountable. So a lot of corporations are huge emissions, greenhouse gas emission producers, but we've started to see that if something becomes core in society, like racial justice or voting rights, in Atlanta, you're starting to get corporations that are pulling away even from people that usually give them money because they don't want to be associated with something that's unpopular. So I do think there's a way we can shift things. And corporations also, there's our individual action in politics. It has shown to really make a difference, to write or call or email or text your elected representatives, no matter what age you are, because they kind of have to say that they're representing constituents. Or like if you live where I live in Kentucky, who has Mitch McConnell, who's a nightmare on all of the issues I care about, at least he can't say that he's doing what all his constituents want, because there are enough of us that pester him, right? So that's an important individual action, is advocacy. I do think that the pandemic did give the earth a rest for a little bit. Michael, as you were saying, we were seeing clear skies, clear waters. We have a partner in Peru who was basically stuck for a year with his 3-year-old in a 16th floor apartment. Like they literally couldn't go outside except for this tiny little balcony. But he said he's never been able to see as far as he could see in that first few months of shutdown. So there was actually an environmental improvement that I think you mentioned, Michael, at the beginning. But we haven't been so convinced that that's worth saving. It's, all of his stuff opens back up, all of the environmental impact is going back up. So the pandemic had a brief positive environmental footprint, but we were overall super concerned with keeping that the way it was. So I think we're going to have to wrestle with what things do we really want to welcome back into our lives after this pandemic. But I think that the discourse, I suspect that the discourse in the United States was dampened around climate change because of the pandemic, also because of the election, but I don't think it was dampened around the world because of the pandemic. The panel that I attended this afternoon was someone from Fiji, someone from Bolivia, and a Gwich'in woman from Alaska. And all three of them live in places that are directly impacted by climate change. So sea level is rising in the Pacific, right? And so they have actual migrants and climate refugees that they have to resettle because those people will no longer be able to live in their homes. In Bolivia, same thing, huge droughts, climate disasters. They're feeling the brunt of it. That's actually one of our grant partners who is the one from Bolivia. And then this woman from Alaska just spoke like our desire to consume energy, that we just constantly have to have our conveniences, and the energy use that we get used to means that oil exploration in places they consider sacred seems to just be okay with us. That for them, they're very spiritually connected to the caribou. They have made commitment to the caribou and feel like they have a relationship back and forth. And the caribou, as we know, are being destroyed by the drilling in the Arctic Wildlife Refuge. And there's just not enough political will. So I think that the pandemic kind of went front and center in the news and kind of shoved climate change aside for a little while in our discourse. But I think that was not true everywhere, because there are places where you can't shove it aside because it's people's daily lives that are being affected. And part of that, I think, to get to Sunny, what you said, is that in the United States, we have a certain amount of privilege that insulates us from climate change. So we have a bad pollution day in Louisville. I don't have to take the bus. I don't have to wait at the bus stop. I don't even have to go outside if I don't want, because I can remote work. I have air conditioning and I have a car if I need it. But those are all individual elements of privilege that I have that insulate us. But as a country, we have a ton of that. We're powerful in the world. We can pull out of the Paris Agreement and not care, for 4 years about other people suffering. And that's not true in a lot of places in the world. That we know that in our country, but everywhere around the world, people who are already facing racism, colonialism, climate devastation from climate change disasters are all people who are already hit by these interlocking oppressions. So in the United States, it's primarily Black neighborhoods that have a lot of toxic waste dumps in them. It's primarily the Native Americans in Louisiana who are going to have to be moved first from their homelands because they're being flooded. There were presentations earlier today that were really good, just showing over and over and over that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are hit first and hardest in our country. But that's also true around the world. So you see Indigenous people in other countries, those who are poor in other countries, those who are already hungry in other countries, then have to deal with things like famine, drought, mudslides. All of those extra implications are a lot harder if you don't have money, if you don't have political capital, if you're not considered as valuable. So I'm hoping that, the pandemic will give us some compassion that we're all connected in the world. Like if a virus starts in this one part of the world, it's not going to stop there. It's the same with climate change. It's the same with, everything else, that we're all one world and we're not isolated. And that could be a positive thing if compassion could catch on, if justice could catch on, that could be a ripple effect. So Yeah, I think it's just a good thing to think about what you can individually do. I think one thing that's important as progressive Christians is we could go with like hellfire and brimstone and damnation. The world's going to hell in a handbasket. The earth is on fire and we're all evil and terrible and we're never going to escape. And that's kind of the apocalyptic writings in one hand of our tradition, is just like everything is crap, right? And, there's no hope. We find that tends to lead to apathy and paralyze people from like doing anything. But we also don't want to be Pollyanna, like, oh, if I take my little recycling, I've done enough. Like that's all I ever have to do as long as I put this piece of paper in the recycle bin. So I think individual action, if we're just aware, it doesn't stop there. But there are a lot of things that we do that do have power, like what companies we support with our money, like where are we buying our products. That money is power. Where are we making our voices heard? Like, ever tried reaching out to an elected representative? That's a personal action that holds a lot of power. And then some of those activities like composting and recycling and so forth are just good practices, because we know that it certainly doesn't hurt and it doesn't take that much effort once you get used to it, and it can help make the world better. So yeah, I think we need to be aware that we ourselves aren't going to change the world by ourselves. But if we don't have enough of us trying, then there's never going to be enough momentum to get things going, because corporations and governments don't have enough incentive to do this until people start moving them to do something. So we just haven't seen a lot of evidence, whether it's with civil rights or with anything else, that corporations or governments ever have these like aha moments. Let's do the moral thing, let's do the right thing. They have very other motivations. So I do think we have a really good invitation to make a change by demonstrating that we're doing those things, so you can do them too. Let me stop there. I'd be happy to share more some of the stories we know about people or communities impacted by climate change, or about things that churches are doing, if that's of interest, in terms of like earth care and climate justice stuff that churches are doing. Or if you want to know any of the theology or biblical reason that Christians get involved in this, and not just Christians. There is a lot of really good interfaith movement around this, certainly. Yeah.
Let me present a couple of questions.
Mm-hmm.
Number one is, we know that we can, it's important to write to our congressmen and congresswomen, and we know that we can write to businesses and so on. But sometimes those individual things we don't think they add up enough, right? We don't see systemic changes. And yet every time we just simply go out on the street and protest, we just wonder, what did that accomplish?
Right.
And so we're left on two sides of the things. So, what are the things that you have seen and about that are coordinated efforts that you believe are making differences beyond what we already talked about?
Mm-hmm.
And the other part of that is, I guess I am really interested in connecting to the world hunger, and what are for example, we never think about was it Bolivia that you mentioned?
Yeah.
The community, what is going on there, because we think of that part of South America and so on, and we think of more mountain, right? And we don't necessarily think about the coastal communities that is there and how that's impacting people. And we just hear about the famine in Africa and so on, but we just don't know. I don't think we just know how many people that are actually on verge of starvation at this point.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if either of those are.
Yeah. I think one of the things that I was hearing today from a lot of the different partners, and this is from Bolivia, Fiji, and Native Alaskan, is one of the things that we have lost sight of in the United States, a lot of Western culture, a lot of white culture, kind of white supremacy value, is just to think of the earth as a thing, to think of nature as separate. And that part of what's happening in a global sense is the reawakening of an indigenous understanding that there is spiritual value in our relationship with the world around us, that the earth is a living, breathing organism that is part of our spiritual well-being. And so are animals like the caribou for this woman who is talking, and that those are siblings. And we do have some of that in Christianity, but most of our Christianity has had this very Western kind of gloss over that's separated it. So when you talk about what's happening globally, hunger really is being impacted by climate change. So some of us visited Lima, Peru a couple of years ago. They're one of our major joining hands networks working on hunger and poverty root causes. And their coordinator's main issue is climate change, because he said that we can't get to anything about human health or well-being or feeding people because the glaciers that are melting at this drastic rate. We actually went to one and saw it, and he described like where it used to be when he was a boy and where it is now. But those glaciers in the Andes are what actually make Lima, the huge city of millions, livable. That part of Peru would naturally be desert. So if you can just imagine all of the people in this humongous city consuming water every day, all of a sudden having no water. So obviously that's a lot of thirst. It's a lot of not being able to bathe. It's not being able to keep clean from diseases like coronavirus, or just being able to keep clean, period, as people. But you can't grow crops if you don't have water either. And in Lima, in Peru, and a lot of countries, they depend on glacial melt at a slow, predictable pace, the way it has always been, to nourish their crops so that they can eat throughout the rest of the year. And when you have this wildly vacillating and melting too fast, you're not going to be able to grow your crops the same way. So that is what we're hearing also in different parts of Africa, but it's happening in South and Central America, as well as somewhat here, with all the fires that the West Coast has been through, with all of these storms that Texas and Florida and other places keep getting hammered with. This isn't what it used to be. And it's making agriculture hard. And a lot of us who grew up in the city could not feed ourselves if we had to. We don't actually know how to grow enough by ourselves to feed ourselves. We depend on this huge infrastructure across the country. So, here in Kentucky, we eat a lot that grows in California. And if you all are having wildflowers, or Florida, their citrus is being saturated by storms, it's going to disrupt the whole food system, even in the United States. So world hunger is really a huge risk right now with climate change. It's not the only risk. I mean, the other thing that's related is, I mentioned earlier, climate refugees, but that's huge. And that's all over the globe right now. So you have tens of thousands and sometimes more people moving because they can't farm anymore, because of drought, because of famine, because of unpredictable agriculture. And so they're making food scarce other places because they've left home. And so then there's this immense pressure on this new place to all of a sudden absorb 40,000 more people in a 20,000 populated village. And they just don't know how. And so that creates famine and other pressure. There is a lot that is making a difference. I mean, there is a lot of coordinated effort that has shown, like when people stand together, it makes a difference. Sunny, you had mentioned the protests, and I did see an article even, I'm in Louisville, Kentucky, where Breonna Taylor was murdered at home by the Louisville Police Department over a year ago. And yet they have shown the cities where all the protests for George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and other have had less statistically police killings than they would in a normal period, because people are in the streets, because people are watching. It doesn't mean they're zero, but in places like where I live, it's not going to be zero yet. But it does show that even just like being out there and holding signs and chanting and all of that does actually have a ripple effect. So, you know, we know our Office of Public Witness does say that because things move so fast in Washington, D.C., things will get to committee, bills we care about, sexual violence, Black maternal health, climate change, will get assigned to a committee. But if they're not hearing from their constituents constantly, it's going to be on the back burner because they've just got too much going on and it's too fast. So your calls do actually make a difference, and enough calls. So like that's what this event this week, Ecumenical Advocacy Days, is 1,000 people all kind of descending on Capitol Hill to all at once as a faith voice say we care about environmental justice and we want to see action. And they do think that that makes a huge difference. But the other coordinated efforts, I think we've seen, Sunny has visited and seen some of our grant partner work that the Hunger Program does. Little Village is a part of Chicago that's been in the news this week from 2 different shootings, but the young boy, the 13-year-old, was from Little Village. So we think probably our grant partners knew him or his family. So we're sending them, a card, but they're making a difference. So there was, it's a primarily Latinx community. They're a huge polluting factory right in their backyards. All these kids live there, play there, and they shut it down. And they had to be constant irritants and constant, they were not well liked, but they did all of this advocacy. Also, in addition to being a contaminated neighborhood, they also had no safe, clean space for their kids to go in the afternoon that was, safe and healthy. And they did this huge coordinated push and got this beautiful park. I don't know, Sunny, if you were there I thought you were on that visit where we just got to see this. And they went from getting a huge park to also now they're doing urban agriculture. So they're growing fruit trees and crops that will actually feed that little super urban environment. Gun violence is real there. I mean, it's partly why it's in the news this week. And yet here is like really scrappy, right, Sunny? It's like this like basement office that like you go into and they service these great pastries, but it's like a hole in the wall, but there's really dedicated people who live in the community and have made these incredible changes because of their passion. They've stopped emissions from this factory. They've created this park, and they also have community celebrations around a community garden where they bring up a lot of folks who maybe migrated there from Mexico or Central America. Well, like have festivals there in the garden related to the foods that they used to grow back in their home countries, and now they can do that again. So there really are some really cool things that are making a difference. And I don't know if I already said, but the faith voice and the nonprofit voice is also really strong at the United Nations climate talk. So you all probably heard about the Paris one, because that was like a really big one a couple of years ago. And then Trump pulled us all out of our commitments there. But the rest of the world was still committed to it. And now, luckily, we will rejoin it. But that's been really important because there are countries like China and India who are still developing the way that the Industrial Revolution taught Western cultures to develop, which is a terrible model. Like they're going to have to skip that. They're going to have to skip to renewable energy and kind of not go down the terrible path we did, which sounds like, in a way, it's kind of a weird privileged thing to say, like, don't make the mistakes we made. But the truth is the earth just can't tolerate it. Like if we haven't learned from the way that Europe went through the Industrial Revolution and created all this toxic emissions and greenhouse gases, like we've got to find a way for people to be fed, for people to have jobs, without it creating all this pollution and all this nasty stuff. So I think the coordinated efforts around the United Nations, international conversations are really important and has really made a difference, because it's getting some countries to commit to things. And you see like Germany and some Northern European countries that have got really ambitious goals for a fully renewable economy. I think that's really going to make a difference.
Anyone else?
What has been the effect of U.S. foreign policy and how that has connected to climate change and how that has connected to the global hunger issue that's going on at the moment in your
I'll say what I can about that question, but with the disclaimer that it's not my real area of expertise. Foreign policy, we do actually, and most denominations have a office near the United Nations and in Washington, D.C., and they know a little bit more about foreign policy and lots of different policy issues. The part that I could speak to is that we had made some really important environmental laws in this country, and we're starting, I think, to incorporate what we were learning in terms of USAID and development work around the world, where renewables, solar, access to clean water would have been front and center. During the Trump administration, all of it rolled back. So we're going to have a hard time just getting back to where we used to be before 2016. That mining was opened in lots of places, more pipelines were given permission, especially through Native American lands. And our foreign policy, we were America first. Basically, like, we don't care about you, rest of the world, foreign policy for a number of years. And whereas usually as a national church staff, I wouldn't be quite so clearly political. Like, there's no way around the fact that everything got eroded in the last couple of years. Like, it's just so stark compared to any other administration, Republican, Democrat, anything, just the actual policy basis. I forget the number, but there were like 80 or 90 environmental policies that were scrapped under Trump. And so there's a lot of work to do, but there's also like so much excitement because Biden has made it super clear that this is a priority and that we're going to take ground back. And I think that's true internationally. And with our foreign policy, I think we're back to being able to negotiate internationally. So I don't know a lot about foreign policy per se, but I do know that kind of climate change, hunger, foreign aid are going to be back to the levels that had been there. And I was just able on last week, today's Monday, okay. So last Wednesday, I was able to Zoom in with the new administrator, Reagan, the EPA administrator, with 6 or 7 other faith leaders, and just to hear like their commitment over and over, and they want to hear from people, and they're going to work on a new methane rule, and they're going to work on fuel efficiency standards for vehicles, and all these things that got decimated like are already on the docket to be reclaimed. So that's really exciting. One of the things that I often would do if I was in person with you, kind of as an introduction, but maybe we could do it as a closing, is to say, we all have different experiences of the holy or divine, or kind of, if you just think of like the connective power, I don't know where you all are on your spiritual journey or faith journey, but if you think of God or whatever would kind of fit in that framework for you, I've often found that people connect to that source, or to divinity through part of the natural world, whether that's relationships with pets or going to the ocean or being in the forest or looking at the sky. So I just wondered if we could go around and kind of say, when you really feel fed or centered, or like God is speaking to you, whatever God means to you, what part of the natural world or relationships would that be for you?
Does anybody want to start off? I mean, because for me, it's kind of I must confess, it's a difficult question to ask, because I'm so accustomed to the city,
Mm-hmm.
even though I live near beaches, but I don't go to the beach very often.
Yeah.
So it's a difficult question for me to ask, or answer, I should say.
Mm-hmm.
All I can say is that I think for me, I just try to slow down, just in general, like forget like, like forget like nature and the beaches and the environment,
Mm-hmm.
just to slow down, because even slowing down in our society is viewed as sort of like a taboo. We don't really know how to slow down as a society. And so I think that's where, for me personally, when I slow down, that's where I find connection with my inner being and with the divine as well.
Yeah.
Because when I slow down, I can reflect, and I can, whatever, be in prayer, whatever it is, I have that time and I have that energy. I think the important thing is the energy to kind of rekindle that relationship between myself and, the spiritual and the divine.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I think it reminds me of kind of nature's cycles, of dormancy and slowing down in winter, or that there's a good period of time where the sun is not shining on a particular part of the earth. And so there is kind of a forced slowing down, if we pay attention to natural cycles. And it's so good for us just to breathe, just to not feel the weight and the pressure of going a million miles a minute. I love that. That's beautiful. Anyone else?
Christina, why don't you go ahead?
Hmm?
You go ahead, Christina.
Oh.
You're muted.
Something that I think there were a couple things that like came to my mind, but I think the one that is most impactful for me is like when I'm camping, and it's usually with my friends or family or whatever, and it's nighttime, and like you have the campfire, but then, and this is, I always forget about the stars. I don't know, I just forget that they're there, and I forget to look at them, and then someone says, oh, look at the stars, and like looking at the sky, and it's so big, and like it sounds cliche, but like making your problems insignificant is kind of like a comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And knowing that there is this whole bigger picture that you kind of, like, it isn't just you, it's like everybody's sort of working to do the thing. So
Mm-hmm.
I like that.
Yeah, that's wonderful.
one of the things I enjoy is canoeing. And it's one of those things that the reason that I like being on canoe and on the water is because, I like this non-mechanical sports. And so it's just simply a boat and a paddle. And, but you are at the whim of the wind and of the currents. And, and everything is you have to be learning to be part of what's there. You can't fight against the nature. I mean, there are days that I've tried because there was one time there, the water, the wind was so high that we're getting 6-foot waves. So that means if I'm sitting on the boat and I'm about 3 feet my head is about 3 feet above the water, and when you got a 6-foot wave coming, that's twice as tall, and you're getting completely swamped in. And when those things happen, you don't go into the wind, you just go the other direction and let the wind take you. But just that, the idea that, nature is a lot more powerful than we think it is. And that we have to live in harmony of that. And if we do, then we can enjoy some incredible things. And one of the things I like being out in the open water and so on is because I like to feel the breeze. I like the wind. And that just tells you, that there is nature is alive and it is moving. And so that's why, to me, the canoe is the one that gives me that sense more than anything else. That's why I go back to Minnesota, to northern, boundary water canoe area. I don't know if have you ever been up there? You can go up into the waters and you can go for a week and you don't see anybody. And you'll be in the areas where there are no motorboats. And you can enjoy that pristine wilderness.
I've heard about it. I haven't been up there, but I've heard how beautiful it is.
Yeah. Christina, did you want to share anything?
Marika?
Marika. Well, I said Christina. Yeah. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Christina, would you like to share again?
Sorry about that. I was looking at Marika's picture, but I was reading. I don't know.
It's not quite as relevant now that I live in Texas, but when I used to live in the Midwest, where we'd get these beautiful big snows during the winter, I always loved just walking outside when it was the early morning or the late evening, and everything was very quiet and peaceful, and just these lovely snowdrifts were blanketing everything, and it felt like the world was muted. You couldn't hear anything beyond the quiet wind. It's just I love the opportunity to just contemplate.
Yeah.
So just two things that came to mind, and we'll call it good. And then you're all welcome to follow up with me anytime you want. But I think all of the things you said reminded me of a discussion earlier where we were talking about part of the power of caring about the earth and climate change and communities that are disproportionately impacted by climate change is because we're actually surrounded by these forces that are exhausting and extractive. So everything from Michael, what you said about time and pressures, to Christina, to thinking like, oh, we're so important, and like all of our pressures get really built up, and you kind of forget the perspective of the broader world. Or, feeling like you're the master of your wind and waves yourself, versus being in a canoe and feeling the relationship and the push and pull of nature, to the quiet of snow, where it's just blankets things and you just exist. The opposite of all of that is this drive that's been behind colonialism and like going forth in the world and colonizing people. It's a huge energy in capitalism, extractive capitalism, this like constant doing, being the center of the universe, being your own master, making lots of noise, making lots of impact on the world around you, and consumerism. So that's why we buy a lot of things, is because we're told we have to be like that. Whereas the reverse, when we work for climate justice or creation care or earth justice, it's like, no, we have time. We can take a breath. We can enjoy the world around us. We can get quiet. We can look at the stars. We can feel the wind. We can feel the water, and just be who we're meant to be as humans. Like, we're a part of the earth and we're an important part, but we're not the whole thing. And so how do we live in harmony with it? And when we're not in harmony, as Sunny said, like, the world pushes back, not like necessarily out of a malicious force. It's just cause and effect. If we do this, the earth is going to do that. So how do we live in harmony with it? And for me, that's kind of the same sense of all of the work we do can be out of gratitude for how good the world around us is. So like we work not out of guilt, not out of like this horrible, evil, like constantly have to produce mentality, but we do it as a joy. It's our practice of gratitude back to the earth for all that the earth gives us, for the snow, for the quiet, for the slowing down, for the water, for the wind, that it's our work of giving thanks that we get to be a part of this world and do our small part. We don't have to do everything. Everybody's going to do something different, and we're all going to cover each other, and we're all going to be community. So if you just find the piece you can do, it will be sufficient. So I thought I will just type in a few links here. I think it's creationjustice.org. And the thing that I'm doing right now, Advocacy Days, may actually have the legislative piece that you could click on the email. I'm not sure if they're doing that this year. But those are a couple follow-up pieces if you're interested in delving more. Sunny, Michael both have my email. I welcome further conversations, but also know you're super busy and you took this time out of your day to come together. And I really honor and admire that. And thank you for spending time thinking about these important things together.
Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca, for taking time out of your schedule. I recognize the time zone differences, and so really appreciate sharing with us, your thoughts and your experiences and your perspectives on these different things. I'm gonna stop the recording.